This screencast discusses the different types of business communication genres of letters, memos, email, and social media. First of all, what do we mean when we talk about genres in technical communication? Well, genres are relatively stable patterns that reflect the activities and practices of the workplace. Genres shape a document's content, organization, style, design, and medium. Genres help writers anticipate the needs of readers and their situations. Here's a diagram of the technical writing process, and you can see how in the producing of a genre, there are several stages. For example, the planning and researching stage, organizing and drafting, improving style, designing the document, revising and editing, and then finally the finished product. But notice that this is not an entirely linear process, but instead it's a rather recursive process where we may go back to some earlier stage in order to continue to improve the content and the look of the document. There are three common genres of business communication. Those are letters, memos, and emails. And in each one of those three, style and tone matter because the style and the tone reflects both the image of you and your company. Letters, memos, and emails often act as the wrapper to larger technical documents. So they will often be the top document on top of let's say a resume, a proposal, or a report that sort of introduces that other larger document. The audiences of letters, memos, and emails can vary. For example, letters are usually written to people outside the company. They tend to be more formal and obviously actually printed on paper. Memos can be written to people inside the company. They could be formal or semi-formal depending upon the audience and the nature of the memo. Typically memos anymore are probably electronically produced. However, they could still be paper. There still could be paper memos inside of a company. And then finally emails, those are written to people either inside or outside of the company. Again, they could be formal or semi-formal depending upon the audience of the company and the nature and purpose of the email. Some of the purposes of letters, memos, and emails are to establish a permanent record, clarify complex issues, guarantee precise, unambiguous phrasing, provide a corroborative record of a conversation, provide a reference for data, and also, as I mentioned earlier, as transmittal documents. In other words, they're placed on top of another document to explain its purpose and its intended recipient. Notice that I also have an asterisk here on the third suggestion of this list, which is guarantees precise, unambiguous phrasing. That's the actual goal, and so as technical communicators, we have to work towards that type of language. Common features of letters, memos, and emails include the header, salutation, the introduction, which sets the context for the rest of the letter, memo, or email by defining subject, purpose, and main point. Any body paragraphs, obviously, that provide content for your readers. Conclusion, then, which rebuilds the context for the readers, restates the main point, and looks to the future. And then the signature line, which is only used in letters and emails, but not in memos. When constructing business communication, we definitely want to consider the rhetorical situation. This places the emphasis on the reader rather than on the author. Now, when we're considering the rhetorical situation, we want to think about tone and style. So, if we are going to convey positive or good information, then we can use what's called the you style. In other words, I'm writing today to tell you that you've won an award. However, if we want to convey negative information or bad information, then we would not want to use this you style. For example, this part is broken and you are the reason why this broke. We want to avoid you if it's negative. We want to use it if it's positive. So we want to create an appropriate tone. We want to avoid any kind of bureaucratic phrasing, partly because it's harder to understand. It doesn't add any new information. It depersonalizes the letter. And because it does depersonalize the letter, it often undermines the one-to-one relationship between the writer and the reader. Okay, let's briefly talk about letters. Using style and design for formatting letters, obviously most companies have their own letterhead, and so if you were to write a letter for the company, you would be using that letterhead. However, if you're writing a letter and it's from you and not the company, and you don't have letterhead, then you can create your own. Typically though, using a piece of stationery that has letterhead on it, you would allow that letterhead then to convey the address of the sender, and then you would create an inside address of the person to whom you are sending the letter, 2 lines below the date or the return address. Include a greeting that belongs 2 lines below the inside address. Dear is an often common greeting followed either by a comma or a colon. We use commas with individuals that we know well. We typically use colons in a business situation where it's someone we don't know well or is merely an acquaintance. And so in that more formal situation, we would use the colon. Here's an example of a letter, and you can see the different elements here. Here's the letterhead, the date, we've got 2 spaces, the inside address, the greeting, body of the letter, and then the closing and the signature, and then the type signature. We always leave 4 spaces between the closing and the signature line here so that the individual has space to actually physically sign his or her name. Notice too that inside the body there are a number of moves that need to happen or elements that need to be included in the body of that letter. So the purpose, the idea, any background information, any other additional information that is necessary. Any kind of persuasive elements if you're trying to get the reader to do something, making sure that you tell them what you want them to do, so action requested, building goodwill throughout, using the appropriate tone, and so forth. If there are any other attachments or closures with the letter, that would go underneath here, the signature line. Okay, let's look at memos. With a memo, the style and design is similar, but not exactly the same. So again, if you are using stationery, you may have the company header up above, and then you would go ahead and begin your memo underneath that. If you don't have that, you can create that for yourself using some program like Word. The subject in the subject line should be a descriptive and specific phrase. In your CC lines, that CC stands for carbon copy, you would include any names of people who would also receive a copy of the memo. In the message line, we don't start with that salutation. In other words, we don't use dear and the person's name. So memos don't include a dear line or a greeting. They just begin with the message in a block style. Here's an example of that. So you can see here's the letterhead up here. Then we have our 4 lines here, the date, the to, the from, and the subject. And notice that the subject should be something that's specific so that the reader knows exactly what this memo is going to discuss. In the body of the memo, the communication form could be formal or informal. Again, it depends on the purpose and the reason why the memo is being created. Memos often include policy statements because they're inter-office communications, forms of communication. They often can have a policy statement in there that the company is sending out for the employees. It could also include a report, again, intended for the internal audience. Notice that the memo has no signature line at the end. Again, that's because we know who it's from, and that's up here at the top of the memo. One other thing that particular example does not display is that if you have a very long memo, you can use headers to help break up the text and organize like things together. And so headers are good because it allows the reader to quickly scan over the document and find the sections in the memo that would be appropriate or pertinent to that particular person. Okay, now let's talk a little bit about email. Email is an electronic blend of the letter genre and the memo genre. Depending upon your email client, in other words, the software that you use to create and send emails, whether you're using something like Gmail or Microsoft Outlook or Lotus Notes or some other program, you know that the email client will format the email in a particular way. And so all of them have similar functions. In other words, they include similar pieces of communication inside that email, but it may look slightly differently than, for example, the sample that I have up here. But typically emails, like a memo, have a to, CC and BC lines, subject line, and then some kind of attachment line, and then a space for a message area. So that's the way in which emails are similar to a memo. The way that emails are similar to a letter are in the aspect of there is a salutation. In other words, there's usually a dear or some other greeting line with the person's name. Then the body of the email, which is similar to both the letter and the memo. And then finally, in the closing there, you do have your signature line, which is typically typed, and then usually it's the person's name with other information about that individual at that particular company. Could be other information too, like company email or website URL, phone numbers, and so forth. So that's a little bit different than the memo, and also slightly different from the letter as far as formatting is concerned. One thing I will point out is that sometimes, depending on the email client, the attachment may be up here at the top, but in some email clients the attachment actually occurs down at the bottom, and so again it just depends on the software, what software is being used. Finally, the last thing I want to talk just briefly about is social media, because in recent years this has become an additional way of communicating, oftentimes within an office. And so this can be important for both corporate and personal communication. It's more common today in various workplaces, and so as we know, we have to sometimes manage not only our physical resume, in other words, things that we actually do every day, but also we have sort of an online persona that we have to manage as well. And so there are professional sites like LinkedIn where you can upload artifacts about yourself, your resume, cover letters, so forth, other things that you want prospective employers to see or know about you. Some companies use other Web 2.0 apps too, like Twitter, not so much maybe Instagram, but Vimeo, YouTube, Yammer, some of these other Web 2.0 applications to communicate, especially if you're working on a team. I know that instant messaging is also a really popular thing that teams use sometimes. Oftentimes companies will have a company blog or website that someone keeps updated. You may have internal wikis inside your company, and sometimes companies even produce video or podcasts about various activities or products that they are developing. So all of these social networking tools, depending upon the company and the uses that the company sees for those, that you may experience or see some of those within the workplace as well. Okay, that's all I have for this particular screencast, and hopefully you have a clearer understanding now of the differences, especially between letters, memos, and emails, and I look forward to speaking with you again soon.